The airport was chaotic, filled with passengers rushing in every direction, announcements echoing over the loudspeakers. But in a single moment, everything abruptly stopped. A loud bang resonated, sharp and reverberating through the crowded gate area like the sound of a gunshot. The cane of an elderly woman was knocked clumsily from her hand, crashing hard against the tiled floor. A scream filled the air as the elderly woman quickly raised her trembling hand to shield herself, her pale blue eyes wide with surprise. In front of her stood a flight attendant, her name badge gleaming coldly under the fluorescent lights. Caroline Whitmore. Caroline's face contorted with disdain, her eyes burning with impatience and irritation as she pointed firmly towards the boarding gate. "I clearly told you to step aside," Caroline snapped, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "First class is not for people like you." A heavy silence, stunned and disbelieving, blanketed the airport. People froze in place, their eyes darting between Caroline and the elderly woman. No one dared intervene, though uneasy whispers began to ripple through the crowd. But Meredith Winslow, the elderly woman, didn't cry out or protest. Her hand trembled slightly, but with quiet dignity and calm defiance, she slowly, deliberately picked up her cane from the floor. Standing tall with a grace that sharply contrasted Caroline's aggression, Meredith looked directly into Caroline's eyes. Her gaze was not one of anger. It was something much deeper, far more powerful. A quiet calm, staring into the soul of the one causing the disturbance with an even more terrifying intensity. In a steady, silent, yet compelling voice that carried a soft but undeniable strength, Meredith spoke words that sent a chill through those who heard them. "You've just made a serious mistake in your career." JFK International Airport at rush hour always felt like a miniature battlefield. Crowds hustling, tense eyes, feet quickly moving toward the boarding gates. The overhead announcements blared continuously, blending with the noise of the crowd, creating a suffocating atmosphere that could make anyone lose their composure. Amidst the hustle and bustle, a figure stood out, seemingly unfazed, unaffected by the immense pressure surrounding her. It was Evelyn Crawford, a black woman in her 60s, her salt and pepper hair neatly styled, dressed in a simple yet elegant emerald green outfit. She held a fine wooden cane in her hand, its head intricately carved, a symbol of understated elegance yet commanding authority. Evelyn's face, marked with a few wrinkles from the passing years, carried a look in her eyes that was impossible to describe, calm, profound, with an air that suggested one should be cautious. Though she made no effort to draw attention, every deliberate step she took on the polished floor made people look up. Evelyn walked steadily toward the first-class boarding gate. However, in the hustle and pressure of the boarding rush, a young blonde woman with an air of arrogance in her flight attendant uniform hurried in the opposite direction. This was Julia Monroe, a white flight attendant, known for her strictness and authoritative demeanor when serving first-class passengers. Focused on the passenger list in her hand, Julia accidentally bumped into Evelyn. The unexpected collision caused Evelyn's precious cane to nearly slip from her hand. Evelyn quickly caught the cane, but the impact was strong enough to make her furrow her brow slightly. Julia immediately stopped, looked up at Evelyn, her eyes scanning her from top to bottom with cold indifference and suspicion. Julia's deep red lips pressed together as her gaze carried visible annoyance, as if Evelyn herself was the cause of this inconvenience. "Please step aside," Julia said in a frosty tone, her piercing blue eyes assessing Evelyn as though she were an obstacle. "This is for first-class passengers only." Evelyn stood still, her gaze calm but razor-sharp, staring directly at Julia without flinching. "I'm well aware of where I'm standing, thank you," Evelyn replied softly but firmly, her voice carrying a natural authority that briefly surprised Julia. Julia frowned in irritation, clearly displeased by Evelyn's composed attitude. In her eyes flashed doubt mixed with clear prejudice. Evelyn, an elderly black woman with a simple appearance, clearly didn't belong in the first-class area, where Julia was used to serving wealthy businessmen and prominent figures. The tense silence between the two women stretched on, drawing the attention of other passengers nearby. A few curious eyes began to turn toward Evelyn and Julia, watching eagerly to see how the situation would unfold. Evelyn stood there, maintaining her dignified posture without uttering another word. In response to her calm defiance, Julia felt challenged. Her eyes flashed with clear irritation as she silently decided that she would not let this go so easily. Neither woman knew that this brief, seemingly accidental encounter would soon escalate into an explosive event, leading to a series of consequences neither of them could have foreseen. But in that moment, amidst the chaos and tension of the airport, Evelyn Crawford stood still, her gaze full of confidence and challenge, facing Julia Monroe, who was nursing a seething resentment, ready to erupt. Amid the increasingly tense atmosphere at the boarding gate, Evelyn's sharp and composed gaze remained locked on Julia, creating an invisible pressure that made the young flight attendant more and more uncomfortable. In the endless moment of silence, the eyes of the crowd began to focus on them, full of curiosity and suspicion. Some passengers, having overheard the exchange, paused, pretending to adjust their luggage or straighten their coats to better observe the unusual situation unfolding. Julia Monroe had always been known among her colleagues for her cold, professional demeanor, but also for being difficult to approach. As the daughter of a former airline pilot, she felt it was her responsibility to uphold the strict standards and order of the airline. For Julia, the position of working in first class was a privilege reserved only for the truly elite and deserving, not something that just anyone could step into naturally. And now, facing Evelyn Crawford, a humble, elderly black woman, Julia couldn't help but feel the deep-seated prejudices bubbling to the surface. She believed that Evelyn was deliberately causing trouble, challenging her authority, or, at the very least, pretending to be naive in order to sneak into an area that Julia felt Evelyn had no right to enter. These biases clouded Julia's judgment, pushing her into a state of losing control. Julia took a deep breath, her green eyes narrowing, her once beautiful but now icy expression becoming sharper than ever. Before Evelyn could say another word, Julia swiftly moved forward, reaching out to yank the ticket from Evelyn's left hand. But Evelyn reacted quickly, instinctively lifting her hand to avoid the grab. However, Julia's frustration only grew, and the more Evelyn tried to avoid her, the angrier she became. Julia pressed forward with an increasingly aggressive and forceful attitude. In a moment of uncontrolled fury, Julia unintentionally, yet maliciously, slapped Evelyn's hand. The hand that was holding her precious cane, an item that was both a support and a symbol of her noble dignity. The moment Julia's hand made contact with Evelyn's, a sound rang out clearly, like a gunshot amidst the suffocating silence. The cane slipped from Evelyn's grasp, falling to the polished marble floor with a sharp, dry thud that echoed through the boarding gate area. Several nearby passengers jumped, turning in alarm, their eyes wide with shock as they struggled to believe what they had just witnessed. Evelyn frowned slightly, the first clear sign of displeasure on her face. She gently glanced down at her cherished cane now resting on the cold floor, then slowly looked back up at Julia, her expression cold and filled with deeper disappointment than anger. Julia, however, instead of feeling remorse, became even more agitated at the unflinching challenge in Evelyn's gaze. Without waiting for Evelyn to speak, Julia declared loudly, her voice dripping with arrogance and contempt, deliberately making sure all the surrounding passengers could hear every word. "I've told you clearly, ma'am, this area is strictly for first-class passengers. People like you don't belong here." The words that came from Julia's mouth froze the crowd in horror and disbelief. This was not just a misunderstanding or a small argument. Her words, delivered with terrifying confidence, were clearly laden with serious racial prejudice. The nearby passengers began to murmur nervously, exchanging glances filled with concern and anger, but no one dared speak up immediately. From a distance, Sebastian Hartley, a well-mannered young businessman who had been watching Evelyn in the VIP lounge, stood frozen, his hand tightly gripping his phone, his eyes never leaving Evelyn, filled with worry and uncertainty about whether he should intervene in this escalating situation. Another passenger, Abigail Miller, a middle-aged woman standing nearby, instinctively raised her hand to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with panic as she looked at Evelyn with a mixture of concern and outrage. In the midst of the rising tension that enveloped the boarding gate area, Evelyn stood still, completely unmoved. Her face showed no signs of fear or anger. Instead, she seemed to observe Julia with a chilling calmness. But behind that terrifying silence, countless questions echoed in her mind. Why, in the 21st century, must she, a successful, socially positioned black woman, still face such blatant racism? Evelyn's cold gaze slowly shifted to the crowd around her, and immediately every eye in the area turned away. She said nothing, but it was her silence that made everyone feel increasingly uneasy. Meanwhile, Julia, the center of the incident, felt the weight of the crowd's scrutiny growing heavier. Yet, with no way out, her prejudices and ego had fully taken control, forcing her to maintain her defiant and confrontational attitude. At that moment, neither of them knew that this shocking incident would soon set in motion a chain of events that would completely change the lives of both women. Amid the suffocating silence of the crowd and the stunned expressions of the witnesses, Evelyn stood tall, head held high, maintaining her dignity, something no insult could ever tear down. In the suffocating atmosphere of the moment, amidst the astonished gazes and the anxious whispers from the crowd, Evelyn remained completely still. Her arm slowly dropped, her eyes lingering on the precious cane that lay cold on the airport floor. The murmurs from the crowd seemed to fade, giving way to an eerie silence. The onlookers' gazes shifted from shock to curiosity and anticipation, all focused on Evelyn, waiting for her reaction. Julia Monroe stood tall, her breath shallow, her face flushed with agitation. Her glossy blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and her bright green eyes, filled with arrogance, also carried a trace of unease in response to the strange calmness of the black woman standing before her. At that moment, she realized that Evelyn's unusual composure was far more frightening than any angry words she had ever encountered. Evelyn slowly raised her head, her clear gaze meeting Julia's directly. Her eyes were deep and full of a latent strength that caused those around them to hold their breath in anticipation. She made no rush, showed no sign of agitation, only calmly observing Julia as if she were watching someone who had made a mistake but hadn't yet realized it. In the frozen silence, Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was soft, even, but clear enough for everyone around to hear every word. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, young lady." Evelyn's words rang out like a bell in the stillness, reverberating strongly and sending a chill down the spines of the witnesses. No one knew exactly what the words meant, but there was something menacing hidden behind these seemingly ordinary words. They were not a hollow threat, nor were they fueled by anger. Instead, they carried a deep and cold warning. Julia took a small step back, feeling the intense pressure of Evelyn's unnerving calm. However, she quickly attempted to hide her unease, lifting her head high and curling her red lips into a defiant smirk. "Are you threatening me?" Julia asked, trying to maintain a fake confidence, though her voice betrayed her, revealing doubt and confusion. "I'm just doing my job as a flight attendant. If you can't prove that you belong here, then please step aside." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly bent down and picked up the precious wooden cane that lay on the cold floor. Her movements, though gentle, were full of authority, highlighting the elegance and dignity she carried. After firmly grasping the cane, Evelyn straightened up and paused for another moment, staring deeply into Julia's eyes. This time, her gaze carried more disappointment than anger. "Threaten?" Evelyn repeated the word softly, as if reflecting on something. "No, dear, I don't need to threaten anyone. But perhaps you need to learn that every word, every action carries consequences that you cannot control." Evelyn's words made the surrounding passengers exchange looks filled with curiosity and confusion. Everyone could sense that there was something much bigger being concealed behind this exchange. Among them, Sebastian Hartley discreetly pulled out his phone, recording the scene. He had a strong feeling that this was no ordinary argument. It could very well turn into a public scandal if Evelyn's true identity were revealed. He didn't know who she was exactly, but with his experience dealing with powerful figures in the business world, Sebastian was sharp enough to recognize that Evelyn was definitely not an ordinary woman. At that moment, Julia Monroe began to feel the weight of the crowd's gaze pressing heavily on her. She quickly scanned the curious and reproachful faces around her, starting to feel as though the situation was slipping out of her control. But her pride and deep-seated biases kept her from backing down. Julia cleared her throat, trying to maintain her usual cold, professional demeanor. "If you really have a valid ticket, then show it immediately. We don't need to waste any more of the other passengers' time," Julia said, attempting to regain control of the situation with a firm tone. Evelyn gazed at her for another moment, then slowly reached into the pocket of her elegant coat. Calmly, but deliberately, she withdrew a boarding pass, carefully encased in a high-quality leather holder. With composed grace, she extended the ticket toward Julia and spoke softly. "I hope you will take responsibility for what just happened. This is my first-class ticket provided by your airline, but it seems that, in your eyes, I'm not worthy of holding it." Julia grabbed the ticket impatiently, scrutinizing the details. Her eyes shifted from skepticism to shock as she read the name Evelyn Crawford and the words First Class 1A. While she didn't immediately recognize the significance of the name, the confidence she had started to waver. However, Julia still tried to maintain her tough exterior, masking the uncertainty that briefly flickered in her eyes. Evelyn Crawford stood perfectly still, her face composed as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet it was her eerie calmness that made Julia and the crowd around them uneasy. In each of their minds, the same question lingered. Who exactly was this powerful black woman, and what consequences awaited Julia Monroe? The moment Julia carefully read the information on Evelyn's first-class ticket, her eyes revealed a sense of unease. It was then that time seemed to slow down, opening up a vivid picture from a few hours earlier. JFK Airport was as busy as usual, but the atmosphere in the VIP lounge was completely different, where tranquility and luxury enveloped the space, in stark contrast to the bustling energy outside. Inside the exclusive lounge for high-end customers, the air was more subdued, with every detail meticulously attended to, from the soft lighting to the premium leather chairs. The staff moved gently, offering drinks and snacks to the distinguished guests who waited. In this refined setting, Evelyn Crawford sat silently by the large window overlooking the runway, her gaze pensive as she observed the planes slowly moving toward their departure positions. She wore an elegant outfit, a sapphire velvet blazer with a simple yet striking white silk blouse underneath, its collar subtly adorned with a silver scarf, reflecting her refined taste, luxurious yet understated. Evelyn's salt-and-pepper hair was carefully styled, the soft curls cascading naturally, highlighting her confident, seasoned beauty. Her hand rested lightly on her precious wooden cane, its intricately carved head a testament to her attention to every detail in her demeanor. Not far away, Sebastian Hartley, a young businessman in his early 30s, polished and immaculate in a dark gray suit, was focused on his laptop. Sebastian frequently traveled internationally for work and was familiar with the luxury lounge. However, today, he sensed something distinctly different, causing his gaze to shift away from the screen and observe the older woman sitting thoughtfully by the window. There was something uniquely captivating about Evelyn that kept Sebastian's attention. It wasn't the overt display of wealth like some other passengers, but rather her calm demeanor, confidence, and the natural authority that radiated from even her smallest gestures. He couldn't help but think that this woman was certainly someone special, a person who had weathered many storms but always managed to maintain her distinct dignity. As Sebastian observed Evelyn with respect and curiosity, Julia Monroe appeared. She had just started her shift and walked into the VIP lounge to quickly check the list of first-class passengers for the flight. The moment she saw Evelyn, she stopped for a moment, narrowing her eyes in clear suspicion. Deep-seated prejudices caused her to immediately assume that Evelyn didn't belong in this upscale space. Julia quickly glanced over Evelyn's outfit, her eyes full of judgment and disdain. In her mind, a woman of color, older, and dressed modestly like Evelyn could hardly afford a first-class ticket worth thousands of dollars. This only increased her discomfort as she saw Evelyn sitting comfortably in the luxurious lounge, as if it were her rightful place. She swiftly approached the service desk and quietly asked the receptionist, "Is that older woman sitting by the window really a first-class passenger?" The receptionist, slightly surprised by the question, politely responded, "Yes, Miss Monroe, she is the passenger in seat 1A for today's flight." Julia frowned slightly, not pleased with the answer, but said nothing further. Instead, she shot another skeptical look at Evelyn, her mind forming increasingly biased conclusions. Blinded by her preconceived notions, Julia didn't pay attention to Evelyn's understated elegance or the calm poise that commanded admiration. Not long after, Julia left the VIP lounge with only one thought in her mind. There had to be some mistake, or the woman was somehow exploiting the special services that clearly weren't meant for her. These negative thoughts grew stronger, gradually taking over her mind, and she made up her mind that when the opportunity arose, she would set things straight in her own way. Meanwhile, Sebastian Hartley continued to observe Evelyn in silence. He saw how Julia looked at her with doubt, and immediately recognized that the young flight attendant was making a huge mistake by dismissing a woman he was certain had to be a powerful, hidden figure. Sebastian told himself that if he had the chance, he would speak with this older woman to learn more about her life and the stories she must have lived through. Evelyn remained sitting quietly by the window, entirely unperturbed by Julia's curious or dismissive looks. She was used to such stares throughout her life, having faced many similar situations in the past, and it was those experiences that had forged her extraordinary composure. At that moment, Evelyn had no idea that her presence in the lounge today would not only leave a strong impression on Sebastian, but would also become the start of a serious event that would unfold shortly after. As time passed, the overhead speaker announced that first-class passengers should prepare to board. Evelyn stood slowly, adjusted her silver scarf, took her precious cane, and leisurely walked toward the door. Sebastian quietly watched her silhouette fade, a mix of curiosity and deep respect stirring within him. Little did he know, just a few minutes later, Evelyn and Julia would create a tense, dramatic situation that would be unforgettable for him and everyone else in the airport that day. From the moment Evelyn stepped out of the VIP lounge, making her way calmly toward the boarding gate, Julia Monroe's anxiety and tension grew even stronger. Her negative thoughts became more distinct, fueled by deep-seated prejudices and stubbornness from the depths of her subconscious. When she looked at Evelyn, she no longer saw a high-class passenger, but a woman deliberately crossing a boundary that, in her view, was not meant for her. Julia stood near the entrance to the first-class cabin, her eyes sharply observing each passenger as they boarded. When Evelyn appeared with her usual composed and confident demeanor, Julia's anger rose even higher. She couldn't tolerate the sight of Evelyn brazenly entering a space she believed was not for someone like her. For Julia, this was no longer a personal matter. It was about protecting the standards and image of the airline, an image she had worked hard for years to maintain and uphold. Julia stepped forward, blocking Evelyn's path suddenly, her cold blue eyes filled with challenge and arrogance. She deliberately raised her voice so all the surrounding passengers could hear clearly. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I need to check your ticket again." Evelyn was momentarily surprised, but quickly regained her calm. She smoothly opened her small, expensive leather bag, took out her carefully folded ticket, and handed it to Julia without a word. The passengers nearby began to take more notice of the situation. A few curious and worried glances exchanged between them. Julia scanned the ticket with a cold, dismissive attitude, frowning as if displeased. She knew very well the ticket was perfectly valid, but her biases were stronger than any logic. She wanted to use this moment to assert her power and authority. "Are you sure this ticket is yours?" Julia asked, deliberately speaking with an unmistakably suspicious tone, offering Evelyn a cold, smug smile. Evelyn remained calm, responding gently but firmly. "As you just saw, it is my ticket, seat 1A on today's flight. I don't understand why we're spending so much time on something so simple." Evelyn's calmness and confidence only made Julia feel even more challenged. Instead of regaining control of her emotions, Julia raised her voice further, causing the surrounding passengers to grow even more curious and attentive. "I think there's something wrong here, ma'am. Our first-class tickets are something not everyone can afford. We've discovered many cases where passengers used fake tickets or illegally upgraded. I won't allow this to happen on today's flight." Julia's words clearly carried a tone of public defamation, causing murmurs among the onlookers. A few people turned to each other, whispering, their eyes a mixture of shock and sympathy for Evelyn. Evelyn, however, remained remarkably composed, not showing any anger or losing her calm. Instead, she responded with gentleness and authority. "I completely understand your responsibility, but my ticket has been clearly confirmed by the airline staff. I suggest you check the system again before making any more baseless accusations like this." But Evelyn's polite words only served to further agitate Julia. For Julia, the fact that Evelyn remained calm and confident in front of her was an even greater offense. She felt as though Evelyn was subtly challenging her authority and reputation, and that only fueled her rage even more. Unable to restrain herself any longer, Julia turned to face the passengers who were watching, her voice rising even more, full of agitation. Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for this inconvenience, but I must clarify that some passengers have been fraudulently attempting to use invalid tickets to access the first-class area. This kind of dishonesty is absolutely unacceptable. The surrounding passengers looked at each other in disbelief, shocked by Julia's public, harsh declarations. Among them, Sebastian Hartley, the young businessman who had observed Evelyn earlier, frowned in discomfort. He could clearly see that Julia was crossing a line and treating Evelyn unjustly, but he wasn't sure whether to intervene. Evelyn looked at Julia with a sharp yet composed gaze. She wasn't angry, nor did she raise her voice in rebuttal. Instead, she continued to assert the truth with the authority she naturally commanded. "I have handed you my ticket for verification. It is completely valid. If you still have doubts, I ask that you check the system immediately. Defaming and insulting a passenger's honor is a serious matter. I trust you understand this?" Hearing this, Julia's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment from being publicly challenged. Her prejudices and wounded pride completely overpowered any rational thought. Instead of stopping to verify professionally, she continued to shout louder. "I don't need you to teach me how to do my job. I know exactly what you're doing, trying to deceive everyone here. I won't allow you to board this flight with your fraudulent ticket." The tension reached its peak. The surrounding passengers were visibly uncomfortable and sympathetic toward Evelyn as the situation spiraled out of control. A few people began recording the scene on their phones, sensing that this could become a much bigger issue. Evelyn Crawford remained standing there, her unsettling calm face unchanged. But deep within her gaze, a deep disappointment was starting to show. Not just toward Julia, but toward the invisible prejudice that still existed in modern society. While Julia allowed her anger and biases to control her every action, Evelyn knew that this confrontation would not end here, and the consequences for Julia could be much greater than she had ever imagined. In the suffocating moment of the confrontation, as Evelyn Crawford's calmness remained unshaken, that very composure seemed to pour more fuel onto the flames of anger burning in Julia Monroe's mind. Julia stood there, breathing heavily, her hands trembling slightly from the tension. Her disappointment mixed with pride, unable to bear the thought that she was losing in front of everyone. The prejudice that had always lingered in Julia's mind now completely controlled her, turning a normal conversation into a battle for honor and power. Julia didn't want to admit she was wrong, and she certainly didn't want to lose control in front of the high-profile passengers, people she always believed she alone had the ability to manage and serve. So, when Evelyn calmly held on to her ticket, Julia felt as though she was deliberately challenging her authority. Unable to keep her composure any longer, Julia suddenly stepped forward and yanked the ticket from Evelyn's hand. The abrupt move startled everyone watching. Evelyn raised an eyebrow in surprise but remained in complete control, her gaze toward Julia, stern but still radiating authority. At that moment, Julia completely lost her ability to think rationally. She no longer cared about the consequences or her own dignity. With her face flushed with anger, she raised the ticket in her hand before the astonished eyes of all the surrounding passengers and shouted, "If you refuse to admit your fraud, then I can no longer accept this fake ticket for another second." Right before the horrified eyes of everyone, Julia began tearing the precious ticket in her hand into small pieces. The sound of the paper ripping echoed sharply in the silent air, like a chilling alarm signaling that Julia had crossed a line. The small fragments of paper fell to the ground, creating a chaotic and tense scene. The passengers standing nearby widened their eyes in disbelief, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. A few people took out their phones to record the incident, while others whispered among themselves, expressing their disappointment and anger at Julia's outrageous actions. Among the onlookers, young entrepreneur Sebastian Hartley stood frozen, his eyes wide with panic and discontent at Julia's over-the-top behavior. He knew Evelyn had done nothing wrong, but the usual caution he maintained in business was now holding him back. Sebastian wanted to step in, to defend the woman he had observed with respect since the VIP lounge, but at this moment he hesitated, afraid that intervening might escalate the situation or affect his own reputation. Not far away, Abigail Miller, a well-dressed, elegant, middle-aged woman, stood witnessing this shocking scene with a worried expression. Abigail, who was highly sensitive to injustice, especially to clear discrimination like this, felt a strong sense of indignation rising within her, wanting to speak up in Evelyn's defense immediately. But she hesitated, fearing that speaking out in such a tense moment might entangle her in the situation or bring about unnecessary trouble. Meanwhile, Evelyn stood silently, but this time her gaze seemed deeper and colder than ever before. She looked at the scraps of paper scattered on the floor, then looked directly at Julia, her expression no longer one of mere calmness but now a sharp warning. "Are you really sure you want to take responsibility for what you've just done, young lady?" Evelyn said, her voice soft but heavy with weight, clear in the eerie silence. Julia felt a dryness in her throat, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She responded with a shaky voice but still full of defiance. "I'm just doing what's right to protect the reputation of this airline. If you want to sue, I'm fully prepared to face the consequences." Evelyn said nothing more. She simply shook her head gently, her disappointment more evident than ever in her gaze. Evelyn's silence now felt more terrifying than any words, for it was her calmness that foretold of an impending storm. The surrounding passengers began to murmur loudly. They were both curious and anxious about what would happen next. Some continued recording the event on their phones, hoping to use it as evidence if this situation turned into a major scandal. The crowd looked at Evelyn and Julia with bated breath, mixed with clear dissatisfaction at Julia's crude and unprofessional behavior. At that moment, Sebastian Hartley took a deep breath, telling himself he needed to do something, but his feet felt as if they were nailed to the floor. For the first time in his life, Sebastian felt powerless in the face of such clear injustice. Julia, at this point, was still unaware of the full gravity of her actions. She tried to maintain a cold, professional demeanor, but panic was beginning to show in her eyes. Julia realized that the situation had gone too far, but she could no longer turn back. In the thick, tense atmosphere surrounding the boarding gate, Evelyn still stood there, her face calm yet stern. She understood that from this moment on, Julia Monroe had crossed a line that she should never have crossed, and the consequences of her actions would surely be far more serious than Julia had ever imagined, not only for Julia herself, but for the airline and everyone present at the airport that day. In the tense and suffocating atmosphere surrounding the boarding gate, as every passenger watched with wide-eyed anxiety mixed with curiosity, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from behind, breaking the heavy silence. A tall man in a sharp black suit quickly approached the scene of the incident. It was Richard Montgomery, the renowned senior manager of the airline, whose authority was second only to the highest-level executives. The moment Richard appeared, all the curious and tense gazes immediately shifted towards him. Richard Montgomery had long been known as a strict, cold man, but always fair and proper in his work. As he approached, his sharp eyes immediately took in the scraps of the torn ticket on the floor and the panicked, disoriented expression on Julia Monroe's face. With just a glance, Richard could tell that a serious situation had just unfolded. He turned to look at Evelyn Crawford, and in that brief moment his sharp gaze softened, turning into deep respect. Without saying a word, he quickly bowed his head gently, but with great formality in front of Evelyn, a gesture that showed respect he had never given anyone before. This action left both Julia and the onlookers stunned and alarmed. "Mrs. Crawford," Richard said in a deep, respectful voice, "I sincerely regret this incident. Please accept my most sincere apologies, as well as those of the airline, for the unacceptable behavior that just occurred." His words rang clearly in the eerie silence, making the surrounding passengers even more curious and astonished. But what shocked them most wasn't the unexpected apology from the senior manager, but the name Richard had just mentioned with such reverence, Crawford. At that moment, Julia Monroe stood frozen, her blood seeming to stop flowing, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as waves of unease and fear rose like a crashing tide. The unusual respect Richard Montgomery had shown Evelyn made Julia realize that Evelyn was not as simple as she had previously thought. Her mind was overwhelmed with negative thoughts, desperately trying to find a reasonable explanation for this increasingly terrifying situation. But when Richard Montgomery turned to face Julia, his gaze shifted from respect to a chilling sternness, his voice ringing out clearly with every word, as if he wanted everyone present to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. "Miss Monroe, I truly cannot understand what you were thinking when you dared to directly insult the chairwoman and CEO of this airline, the person who founded the airline group you are serving. Mrs. Evelyn Crawford is the one who built the brand and reputation of our airline from the ground up. Your thoughtless and disrespectful actions have crossed far beyond acceptable limits." Richard Montgomery's words resonated with such authority that Julia seemed frozen in place. Her face turned pale, as though all the blood had drained from it, her lips trembling, unable to utter a single word. She realized she had just made the gravest mistake of her life, one that could never be undone. The passengers around her immediately began to murmur, their gazes turning to Evelyn Crawford with a mix of astonishment and admiration. None of them could have imagined that the elderly, calm, and composed woman whom Julia had just insulted was the powerful chairwoman and CEO of this renowned airline. Several passengers immediately began recording the scene, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would soon become hot news on social media and the press. Sebastian Hartley, the young entrepreneur who had witnessed the entire situation, felt stunned by the revelation. He had suspected that Evelyn wasn't an ordinary person, but he never imagined she held such immense influence. At this moment, Sebastian could only shake his head regretfully for Julia, who had underestimated others based on her misguided prejudices. Julia Monroe was now barely able to stand. Richard Montgomery's words echoed in her head, like a heavy sentence from which she couldn't escape. She turned to look at Evelyn with a horrified gaze, silently pleading for forgiveness, but Evelyn merely looked at her with disappointment and pity. Throughout all of this, Evelyn Crawford maintained her admirable, calm demeanor, never showing any signs of gloating or anger at Julia's humiliation. She simply nodded gently at Richard Montgomery, then spoke in a soft but powerful voice. "Thank you, Richard. I don't want to make a big issue out of this, but there are actions we cannot accept if we want to preserve the values and reputation of this airline. I think Miss Monroe will need to reflect very carefully on what happened today." Evelyn's calm words made Julia feel even more humiliated and helpless than ever. At that moment, she realized that her actions were not just a personal mistake, but had caused serious consequences for the reputation of the airline she had served, a place she had once been proud of and invested so much in. Under Richard's stern gaze and Evelyn's commanding silence, Julia Monroe understood that her career at the airline had officially ended at this very moment. But more than the loss of her job, Julia felt a deep sense of shame and embarrassment, realizing that her prejudices and blind arrogance had completely destroyed the future she had once worked so hard to build. Amidst the surrounding chatter and the tense atmosphere, Evelyn Crawford stood there with her usual serene composure, despite her secret identity now being revealed. She knew that, after today, not only Julia Monroe but everyone who had witnessed this event would learn a valuable lesson about respect and fairness, principles that she had spent her whole life protecting and preserving. As Evelyn's calm yet weighty words came to an end, the tension in the boarding gate area grew even more oppressive. All the passengers who had witnessed the scene stood still, whispers starting to rise like small waves, but everyone made an effort to keep their comments discreet and cautious. Julia Monroe, at this moment, felt as though she had fallen into an endless abyss, her eyes wide with confusion and despair as she fully realized the serious consequences of her actions. Richard Montgomery glanced at Julia once more with a stern look that could not be hidden. He then slowly took out his phone from his jacket pocket and made a call to the cockpit with an authoritative tone. "Captain Reynolds, this is Richard Montgomery. Please summon Flight Attendant Julia Monroe to the cockpit immediately. We have a serious situation that needs to be addressed before the flight departs." Richard's words rang cold and clear, sending a chill down Julia's spine. Each word felt like a needle piercing her mind, signaling that the moment of judgment and accountability had arrived. Julia's mind went blank, her heart pounding in her chest from fear and profound regret. A few minutes later, a security staff member from the airline approached, speaking in a polite yet serious tone. "Miss Monroe, please follow me to the cockpit immediately. The captain and the vice president of the airline are waiting." Julia swallowed hard, knowing she had no choice but to comply. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to remain steady as she walked behind the security officer, under the sympathetic yet reproachful gazes of the surrounding passengers. It felt as though she was walking down an endless road, each step like a knife cutting deeper into her sense of dignity, forcing her to face the consequences of her own actions. When the cockpit door closed behind her, Julia felt a heavy pressure in the air inside. In front of her was Captain Jonathan Reynolds, a man with salt-and-pepper hair and a sharp, stern gaze, known for his strict demeanor. Sitting next to him was Stephen Caldwell, the vice president of the airline, one of the most powerful men, famous for his commitment to maintaining discipline and ethical values within the company. Stephen Caldwell looked at her with cold, stern eyes, his face betraying deep disappointment. Without wasting time with pleasantries, he immediately began questioning Julia in a clear, sharp tone. "Julia Monroe, are you aware that your recent actions were not only a breach of professional ethics, but also an extremely serious act of racial discrimination?" Julia felt as though a heavy stone had pressed down on her chest, and she could hardly breathe. She looked down, trying to avoid Stephen's intense gaze, but she could not escape her responsibility. Stephen continued, his voice growing more forceful. "I am waiting for your explanation. Why did you openly insult and humiliate Chairwoman and CEO Evelyn Crawford in front of all the passengers? Why did you tear up her ticket in public, accusing her of fraud when she had all the valid evidence?" Julia tried to regain her composure but failed completely. She trembled as she responded, struggling to find a justification. I didn't know it was Chairwoman Crawford. I was just following protocol." Stephen immediately cut her off, his tone laced with sarcasm but still stern. "What protocol allows you to insult and demean a passenger based solely on their appearance, Miss Monroe? Do you understand that what you just did is the clearest manifestation of racial prejudice, something that our airline can never tolerate?" His words pierced through her like a sharp blade, and Julia felt as though the space inside the cockpit was closing in on her. Stephen Caldwell looked at her one more time, his gaze shifting from sternness to deep disappointment. "I want the truth, Julia. You have to admit that you acted this way because of racial prejudice. Own up to your mistake right now, if you want to preserve any shred of dignity left." Julia felt tears begin to well up, and she could no longer hold back the shame and humiliation. Finally, she bowed her head, her voice trembling and weak as it broke the silence of the cockpit. I was wrong. I let my prejudices influence my actions. I made a terrible mistake in treating Chairwoman Crawford unfairly just because of her appearance. I'm sorry. I am truly sorry." The silence in the cockpit enveloped them once again, but this time it was the silence of profound disappointment. Captain Jonathan Reynolds sighed softly, not speaking a word, but his eyes clearly showed his deep disillusionment with Julia's actions. It was Stephen Caldwell who finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight and authority of a leader. "Your apology is too late, Julia. Your actions have caused significant damage to the reputation and image of our airline. Moreover, you directly insulted the founder of this airline, the person who has devoted her entire life to building a fair, equal, and professional working environment." He paused for a moment, then concluded in a cold but resolute tone, "We will hold an urgent disciplinary board meeting after this flight to make a formal decision regarding your conduct. But from this moment on, you are suspended indefinitely, and I suggest you reflect carefully on what just happened, on the severe consequences that your prejudice and irresponsibility have caused." Julia stood motionless, tears streaming down her face, understanding that her career had just officially ended, and more than that, she understood that this painful lesson would stay with her forever, reminding her of the catastrophic consequences of allowing prejudice and arrogance to control her actions. As the cockpit door opened once more, Julia stepped out with a dazed and panicked expression, tears still fresh on her cheeks. The atmosphere inside the plane was unusually quiet, each passenger watching her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Julia knew that the consequences she now faced were not limited to her suspension. She had been forced to leave the cabin and perform something even heavier than any punishment, a public apology before all the passengers. In the cramped space of the first-class cabin, Evelyn Crawford remained seated, calm and composed, her demeanor unshaken despite the recent tension and severe insult. She did not show any joy or self-satisfaction at seeing Julia approach with a face full of shame. Instead, her gaze remained steady, serene, but deeply profound. Richard Montgomery stood beside Evelyn, his face serious and resolute. He was the one who had just demanded Julia make the public apology, as an example for all airline staff, and as a pledge to the passengers that this airline would never tolerate any acts of racial discrimination again. Julia moved forward, her body feeling heavier than ever. She took a deep breath, gathering the last remnants of courage to face Evelyn's stern gaze and the intense attention of the entire cabin. The eyes fixed on her made her feel more panicked and uneasy, but she knew she had no other choice. She lowered her head, her voice trembling and choked, but she tried to speak clearly so all passengers could hear. "Miss Crawford, I apologize for what just happened. I acted disrespectfully and insulted you gravely. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and that was a terrible mistake. Please accept my sincerest apology." Her words rang clearly in the silent cabin, but the response she received was a cold silence from Evelyn. This silence was not forgiveness or easy acceptance. It was the silence of someone who had experienced and endured many injustices without ever losing her dignity. In that moment, Evelyn slowly raised her head, her sharp gaze locking directly onto Julia. Her voice then rang out, soft but powerful, each word clear and deliberate. "I accept your apology, Julia, but I have a question I want you to think about and answer truthfully in front of everyone here." The cabin grew even quieter, and all passengers held their breath in anticipation. Everyone sensed that the upcoming question would be crucial, capable of awakening a deep truth they often avoided in their daily lives. Evelyn continued, her eyes not leaving Julia's, her voice slow and very clear. "Would you be apologizing to me like this if I were just a regular black woman, not the chairwoman or CEO without power or status?" That question struck Julia's mind like a bolt of lightning, leaving her speechless. The cabin immediately buzzed with whispers, the passengers exchanging meaningful looks, deeply affected by Evelyn's words. It was a decisive question, a harsh truth that no one could easily face or deny. Julia stood frozen, her mouth open but unable to speak. Evelyn's question was like a mirror reflecting deep into her soul, exposing the painful truth she had always tried to avoid. She had not regretted her discriminatory actions until she realized that Evelyn was a person of power. And if Evelyn had been just an ordinary woman, Julia certainly would not be standing here, nor would she have ever realized the serious mistake she had made. Julia felt all the strength drain from her body. She bowed her head deeply, her shame spreading across every gesture and expression. Unable to say anything further, Julia could only stand there, enduring the overwhelming humiliation she had brought upon herself. Watching this scene, Sebastian Hartley and Abigail Miller, the passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal, no longer felt curious. Instead, they shared a deep empathy and understanding for the profound lesson Evelyn had just imparted to everyone. The tension in the first-class cabin eventually began to ease, but the echo of Evelyn's question continued to reverberate. Evelyn looked at Julia once more, her gaze no longer cold, but now softened with a touch of gentleness, though still stern. "Julia, I hope that after today, you will truly understand that dignity and respect should never be judged by appearance or social status. We must treat everyone with fairness and respect, no matter who they are, no matter their race or background." Julia nodded weakly, tears falling once again, this time tears of awakening and sincere regret. Evelyn's final words were a valuable and profound lesson for everyone on that flight that day, a lesson about fairness, respect, and the devastating consequences of allowing blind prejudice to guide one's actions. The atmosphere on the flight still carried the lingering scent of tension, as if everyone was still trying to shake off the shock of what had just transpired. After the painful public apology and the ruthless question from Evelyn, which reflected the harsh truth that Julia had to face, it seemed like everything would stop there. But no. It was Richard Montgomery, the highest-ranking officer on the flight, who made an unexpected decision that took the entire crew by surprise. Julia Monroe would continue her duties, but not as before. She would serve Evelyn Crawford throughout the flight as a symbolic punishment, and as a stern warning about the consequences of racial discrimination. A wave of murmurs spread throughout the first-class cabin as the announcement was made. Some passengers exchanged glances with a sense of satisfaction, not because they were glad to see someone humiliated, but because they felt that justice was being restored. The others remained silent, but their eyes betrayed curiosity. Everyone wanted to witness such a dramatic role reversal. Julia said nothing. She lowered her head to receive the orders. Inside her, it felt like something was breaking into pieces. Not just the shame, but the delayed realization of the beliefs she had blindly held. She slowly walked back to the first-class cabin, where Evelyn sat motionless, her demeanor unwavering. as if no storm could ever touch her. "May I get you anything, Miss Crawford?" Julia asked, her voice dry, but she tried to keep calm. Evelyn looked up, her gaze neither contemptuous nor cold, just serene, with a hint of sadness. She gave a small nod. "Black tea, no sugar, and a few slices of fresh lemon." Julia nodded and turned to leave. Behind her, the eyes of passengers like Sebastian Hartley, Abigail Miller, and many others were fixed on her, making every step feel heavier on her already shattered sense of dignity. Never before in her 10 years as a flight attendant had she felt so disconnected from the uniform she wore. When Julia returned with the tray of tea, she lowered her head and presented it to Evelyn. Every movement was slow, almost excessively careful, as if she were performing a ritual rather than a routine service. Evelyn accepted the tea, placing it gently on the small table in front of her, her eyes never leaving Julia. "Have you ever served a guest like this before?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft like a breeze. Julia hesitated, replying quietly, "No, never." "Do you remember how you felt when you saw me enter the VIP cabin earlier?" Evelyn continued, not waiting for an answer. "Your feeling at that moment was doubt, discomfort, the kind of thing people politely call intuition, but really it was prejudice, an old reaction nurtured by biased, unfair views." Julia fell silent. Evelyn's words, though not harshly critical, pierced through the fragile shield she had tried to build to hide her regret. Evelyn took a sip of her tea, then set the cup down and turned her gaze to the window, where the white clouds passed swiftly beneath the wings of the plane. "Luckily, you're not the first person to think I don't belong here, and you won't be the last. But today, I hope you'll be one of the few who dares to face your mistakes and change because of them." Those words weren't just for Julia. They resonated within all the passengers who were quietly witnessing the silent exchange between the two women, one who had been humiliated for her skin color and simplicity, and one who had once used her small power to judge others. Julia began her task of serving Evelyn for the rest of the flight, no longer as the head attendant but as an apprentice. She had to bring every dish, adjust the pillows and blankets, listen attentively to Evelyn's every request, showing absolute respect. Not because Evelyn was the CEO, but because Evelyn was a person Julia had once tried to deny, simply because she didn't fit the image Julia thought was right. The other passengers whispered, exchanging looks filled with meaning. They didn't speak out, didn't clap, but inside they were stirred. Each person, in their own way, was reminded about how they had once silently accepted injustice, or ignored a dismissive look in the past because they thought it wasn't their concern. Abigail Miller, the blonde lawyer sitting in seat 4B, leaned her head and whispered to Sebastian, "I've never seen a punishment so gentle, yet so heavy." Sebastian nodded, his eyes still on Evelyn. She doesn't need to say much. Just her presence is a lesson in itself. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Gone was the suffocating air, the hidden prejudice beneath the luxurious exterior. Instead, there was an awakening, a living lesson about how to treat one another, a lesson that Julia Monroe and many other passengers would carry long after the plane touched down. The flight passed in an unusual stillness, not peaceful, but as if each person was lost in their own thoughts, confronting the thoughts they usually avoid, and amidst the vast expanse of the sky where one can easily feel small, Julia Monroe was facing the greatest challenge of her life, herself. Evelyn, the woman Julia had once looked down on, was now the center of the first-class cabin, but not through the power of her CEO status nor her wealth, but through her composure, sharp intellect, an admirable generosity. It was this composure that created a weight Julia could not escape. In the moment when Julia bent down to adjust the pillow behind Evelyn, her voice rose, soft as a whisper, yet resonant like a bell in Julia's consciousness. "Have you ever had your ability questioned because of your skin color, Julia?" Julia flinched. The question wasn't thrown like an accusation. There was no anger, no sarcasm, just a simple question. But it felt like an arrow piercing through the invisible armor Julia had wrapped around herself. She stood still for a moment, her hands clenched behind her back, trying to suppress the strange tremor in her chest. "No," she replied hoarsely. I've never been questioned because I'm white." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded quietly, as if she had already known that answer. But the way she looked at Julia, gentle yet stern, made Julia feel smaller than ever. "Then you've lived a life that many can only dream of," Evelyn continued, her gaze fixed on the window where the clouds drifted by like fragmented memories. "You're allowed to walk into a VIP lounge without being questioned. You're trusted without needing to prove anything. You can make a mistake without it being blamed on an entire community." A lump rose in Julia's throat. Evelyn's words, though not accusatory, hurt more than any criticism ever could. Suddenly, images flashed through her mind like a film rewinding. The times she had frowned at a person of color sitting in first class. The times she had unconsciously called to security just because a black boy had mistakenly entered the business class area. The times she had sighed in discomfort when serving someone not dressed in designer clothes. All of it was so clear, like an invisible indictment. And then, the clearest image of all hit her. Evelyn's eyes when she slapped her hand. Not a look of anger, but one of pain, as if Evelyn didn't hurt from the insult, but from the fact that once again, the old past had repeated itself in a new form. Julia turned away, unable to bear Evelyn's gaze any longer. She walked quickly toward the galley, where only the hum of the plane filled the silence. She leaned against the food cabinet, her shoulders trembling. She didn't cry out loud, there were no sobs, just silent tears falling, a long-delayed release of a person who was seeing herself not through a mirror, but through someone else's eyes. When she returned, Evelyn was still sitting there, calm as if nothing had happened. Julia bent down, carefully placing the fruit tray on the table, then suddenly spoke softly. "I'm sorry for everything. Not just for today's actions, but for all the things I thought and did without realizing." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. "Change begins with awareness, Julia. And pain is the first price we must pay." The air between the two women was no longer a battleground. It was a moment of understanding. Throughout the first-class cabin, though no one spoke, the shift was felt, like witnessing a soul breaking, then being reborn. On the opposite side, Sebastian Hartley quietly wrote a line in his notebook, his eyes still on Evelyn and Julia. "There are lessons that cannot be taught with words. They can only be etched in through wounds, where pride is pierced by the truth." The flight continued through the still sky, but inside the hearts of those aboard, a storm was slowly passing. And from after that storm, the first rays of awareness began to shine, from a simple yet profound question. Have you ever had your ability questioned because of your skin color? A question not just for Julia, but for all who have ever thought themselves different, forgetting that the only thing that should truly differ is whether their hearts have truly learned to empathize. As soon as the plane's wheels touched the ground, the sense of relief hadn't yet spread through the cabin when a tense atmosphere immediately took over. Julia Monroe didn't need anyone to remind her of what awaited her behind the airport doors. She didn't head straight to the crew rest area as usual, but was escorted by 2 security officers to a secluded room, a place once reserved for the most serious incidents in the airline's history. The brass plaque affixed to the heavy door clearly read, "Strategic Meeting Room, Executive Board." A place no flight attendant ever wanted to enter unless invited for a ceremonial recognition. Inside the soundproof, cold room, fluorescent white lights illuminated a long conference table surrounded by waiting faces. At the head of the table sat James Whitaker, the chief operating officer, famous for his cold demeanor and zero tolerance. He was flipping through the thick dossier titled Flight 934 Incident, Allegations of Severe Racial Discrimination. Sitting next to him was Stephen Caldwell, the executive vice president who had faced Julia in the cockpit. But today, his gaze was not one of angry outbursts. Instead, it was one of quiet disappointment, more bitter than any reprimand. Julia stood there, her uniform crumpled from the long flight, her hair hastily pinned to the side, her hands clenched tightly in front of her stomach as if trying to keep herself from trembling. There were no rows of passenger seats to hide behind her fake smile, no head flight attendant name tag to convince herself of her power. Only one person, bare and exposed, facing the consequences of her own actions. James Whitaker spoke first, his voice even and professional, like a surgeon's scalpel cutting through the matter at hand. "Ms. Monroe, we have gathered full statements from passengers, video footage from the first-class cabin, and reports from the flight crew. Do you have anything to say before we make a disciplinary decision?" The room fell silent. Julia took a deep breath, her voice hoarse, but no longer trembling as it had before. I admit that what happened on this flight was entirely my fault. I acted without control, without respect for the passengers, and worst of all, I allowed my prejudice about skin color to guide my behavior. A brief moment of shock rippled across the faces in the room. For an employee to admit to committing an act of racial discrimination in front of senior leadership was unprecedented, not just in the company but rare in the aviation industry as a whole. No one had forced Julia to say it. No lawyer was by her side. But she said it as if she too needed to hear that confession aloud to stop denying it. Stephen Caldwell nodded slowly, as if finally hearing what he had hoped Julia would face. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" he asked, his voice deep. Julia answered, this time without hesitation, "I understand, and I am ready to face any form of discipline, even termination. But may I add something?" James gestured for her to continue. Julia swallowed hard, looking up at the leadership team. Her eyes reflected an undeniable regret. "I used to think of myself as a good person, polite, diligent, not hurting anyone. But I didn't realize that. Sometimes evil doesn't need to shout or strike. It can come in the form of glancing past someone without meeting their eyes, of doubting someone just because of their skin color. And when I slapped Evelyn Crawford's hand, I didn't just hurt her. I tarnished this entire system." No one said anything, but the air in the room seemed to shift. It was still stern, but no longer felt like a cold tribunal. It was a place where one had to face their humanity, the ugly side, and the possibility of redemption. After a minute of silence, James Whitaker closed the dossier and folded his hands in front of him. "The disciplinary board will meet within the next 24 hours. For now, you are suspended without pay, and your airline passport will be temporarily revoked. You will also be required to attend a special training program on racial awareness, supervised by none other than President Evelyn Crawford herself. After that course, the board will review whether you will be given a second chance." Julia bowed her head. Not in disappointment, but because inside her, something greater than the fear of losing her job had grown. The awareness that if given the chance to start over, she would never let the belief in what is right be clouded by narrow-minded views. Before leaving the room, Stephen Caldwell stood up and walked toward Julia. He didn't extend his hand, nor did he smile. He simply said one sentence, both a warning and a reminder. True courage is not just about daring to fly into a storm. Sometimes it's about daring to look at the darkest part of yourself and not turning away. The door closed behind Julia, and in the cold of the empty hallway she knew. The hardest part wasn't this meeting. It was the journey ahead, where she would have to learn to see the world not through the lens of prejudice, but with the wide-open eyes of someone who had stumbled and was now trying to rise again with all her heart. The meeting room door had barely closed behind Julia when, less than 10 minutes later, it opened once more. But this time, the person who entered was not an investigator or internal affairs manager. It was Evelyn Crawford, always composed, her silver hair neatly pinned up, her neutral gray suit hugging her figure, her polished black leather shoes clicking with each deliberate step across the wooden floor. The already serious room now seemed to carry an additional layer of presence, silent yet heavy with authority. Everyone in the room, including Director James Whitaker, stood as she entered. Evelyn gave a small nod, her gaze neither showing anger nor hurt, but it gleamed with determination, as if she were not here to end a crisis, but to begin a new chapter. "I'd like to say a few words to the council," Evelyn said, her voice deep and clear, without a hint of tremor or fury. "I know you are all waiting for the final disciplinary decision regarding Miss Monroe, and I could leave it to the usual internal procedures. But this incident, I believe, cannot be seen as just a mistake." The heavy atmosphere in the room seemed to thicken even more. People thought Evelyn would call for the highest level of punishment, or perhaps suggest immediate termination. No one dared interrupt. But what happened next left everyone in stunned silence. "I do not recommend firing Julia Monroe," Evelyn said slowly, clearly. James frowned. Stephen Caldwell widened his eyes. Some of the advisors at the table lowered their gaze to their documents, unsure if they had heard correctly. But Evelyn stood there, calm at the center, as if she had considered this decision beforehand, each word deliberate. Firing someone for racial discrimination sounds fair and just, but it would make us overlook something important: the opportunity to change, the chance to make amends. Julia is not the first to have their professional judgment clouded by prejudice, and sadly, she won't be the last. But if we don't start with her, then when will we begin? She paused for a moment, then turned to Stephen. "I propose that instead of firing her, we impose a disciplinary action coupled with rigorous re-education, a 6-month intensive training course on cultural awareness, inclusive behavior, the history of racial discrimination, and methods for dismantling internal biases. Julia will not be allowed to work on any commercial flights during this period. Each stage of her training will be reported directly to me." She then turned to James. "Additionally, I suggest we establish a new professional conduct and ethics evaluation board with the authority to oversee cases like this, not just to handle them, but to help transform employees from the roots up. Julia will be our first case." The room fell silent for several long seconds. Stephen was the first to speak, his voice still tinged with skepticism. "Miss Crawford, are you sure this decision won't be misunderstood as too lenient? After all, you are the victim in this case." Evelyn responded, her gaze sharp. "I don't need pity or revenge, Stephen. I need to see a system that improves after each stumble. Firing someone doesn't make us a better airline. It just teaches people like Julia to hide their flaws deeper until they resurface elsewhere at another time. I want to try changing that." Finally, Julia was called back into the room. As she entered, her face still carried traces of confusion, not quite expecting anything good to come of this. Evelyn approached her directly, without any intermediary. Her voice softened, but her eyes never left Julia's face. "I've asked the council not to fire you, not because I forgive your actions, but because I want to place before you a tougher challenge, real change. You will undergo 6 months of training, under strict supervision. You will have to prove that you can become part of a future where there is no racial discrimination in this industry. And if you fail, there will be no second chance." Julia stood frozen, her eyes welling up, not because she was spared from a sentence, but because for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be trusted when she didn't deserve it. She bowed deeply before Evelyn, trembling. I know I don't deserve your help, but I will not let you down." Evelyn nodded slightly. "I don't need your gratitude. I need you to overcome yourself." In that room, the silence was no longer a pressure. It was a beginning, an opportunity, a transformation that might not be easy but was undoubtedly necessary. And Julia Monroe, the one who had let prejudice overshadow her conscience, was standing at the crossroads of her life. For the first time, with a map she herself would have to learn to redraw from scratch. The atmosphere in the meeting room gradually softened after the council concluded their meeting. The leadership members filed out one by one, leaving only Evelyn and Julia standing in the now eerily quiet room. No more scrutinizing glances, no more policy papers or the sound of typing. Just the two women standing on opposite sides of a mistake, facing each other in silence. Evelyn sat down in the chair by the window, where the late afternoon light quietly filtered through the frosted glass. She didn't gesture, didn't point, didn't force anything. But Julia, almost instinctively grateful, also pulled out a chair and sat down opposite her, her back stiff, her hands clenched. Evelyn looked at Julia for a long time, as if contemplating where to begin. Then, with her trademark deep and warm voice, which had been her hallmark throughout her years in the aviation industry, she spoke. "You know, Julia, when you ripped the ticket from my hand and tore it in front of everyone, I didn't immediately feel anger. I felt tired. So tired I wanted to turn away." Julia swallowed hard, her eyes avoiding Evelyn's gaze, as though those words had struck at her deepest, most vulnerable spot, the shame that could never be wiped away by any apology. But then I remembered the first time I was denied boarding, even though I had a ticket in my hand. I was very young. I worked twice as hard to afford that ticket. It was just economy class, nothing special. But I had dreamed about it for a month. I stood there, hearing them say to my face, "Your name is not in the system." Even though I had the printed ticket in my hand, with the confirmation code. But they still called security and had me escorted out. Just because I was a black girl wearing old clothes standing out among a crowd of white passengers. Julia blinked, a tear falling down her cheek, and she didn't bother wiping it away. Evelyn continued, her tone free from any bitterness, only the rawness of truth. "I'm not telling you this to make you pity me, Julia. I'm telling you so you understand. Today is not the first time, and I am not the first. Millions of others have been and are still going through this, silently, with no one to defend them, no one standing up." Evelyn paused, resting her elbow on the armrest, her eyes filled with experience, as they locked onto Julia. "If I were just a regular old black woman, with no title, no power, today, you wouldn't have to apologize to me, would you?" Julia nodded, as if lowering her head in confession before an invisible judge. "That's right. I don't know why I became the person I did. I was raised well. I thought I was fair. But at that moment I just saw you, not like the people I usually serve, and I let my judgment dictate my actions." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her voice sharpening, not to scold, but to cut through the last layers of defense that still clung to Julia. "You're not the first person to think they were raised well and still hurt others. The issue is, when you're not the one judged by the color of your skin every day, you don't understand how deeply that affects someone else's life. Do you know why I didn't fire you?" Julia shook her head, her tears smearing her mascara, creating 2 long streaks down her cheeks. Evelyn leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Julia's face. "Because revenge is the easiest way, but change takes courage. I don't need you to disappear from this airline. I need you to face yourself, learn from scratch, and use your own experience to help others not become the Julia Monroe next time." The silence fell again, but this time it carried with it an awakening. Julia trembled, not just from shame, but because for the first time in her life she felt her heart shifting, not out of fear, but because of the weight of a great compassion she had never imagined she would receive. I promise, I won't let this opportunity be meaningless," she whispered, almost as if swearing to herself. Evelyn stood up without another word. As she walked out of the room, she left behind a woman sitting amid the wreckage of her own prejudices, beliefs she once thought were normal, and now had to rebuild from scratch, piece by piece. The door closed softly but firmly behind Evelyn. In that moment there was no need for announcement, no need for justification. She had planted a seed of change, not in an organization, but in a person. And sometimes that is the only place a true revolution begins. The door closed behind Evelyn Crawford, leaving Julia Monroe alone in the now empty conference room. The afternoon light filtered through the thick window panes, making the room so quiet that Julia could hear her own trembling breath. But within that stillness something was changing. Not externally, but deep within her soul. She no longer cried. The tears had stopped falling, replaced by a heavy feeling, but it was no longer just shame, it was responsibility. A profound realization was seeping into every breath, every heartbeat of Julia's. She had lived her life in a world designed to conceal prejudice, to mask injustice under the guise of procedure and rules. And it was Evelyn, with her terrifying calm and unexpected compassion, who had torn that veil apart with just a few words, a look, and the refusal to seek revenge. The next day, Julia arrived early, even before the anti-bias training center opened. She dressed simply, no makeup, no polite smile that once graced her face when she stood in first class with a coffee cup in hand. She stood before the door as if standing at a crossroads in her life, and truly, it was. No more flight attendant uniform, no more shiny name tag, no more neatly packed suitcase trailing behind her like the part of her image she had once obsessed over maintaining. There was only a person, carrying with her the baggage of mistakes and the desire to change. Inside the classroom, the instructor, a middle-aged Asian man with a smile in his eyes and a voice as soft as a breath, greeted Julia with a friendly nod. "Welcome to your journey of self-discovery," he said, without judgment, without mentioning the past. "Here, everyone once carried a distorted mirror, but our mission is to wipe it clean so we can see ourselves and others more honestly." Julia fell silent. Those words weren't just the opening of a course. They were the outstretched arm of a world she had once turned her back on. For weeks that followed, Julia endured difficult sessions. There were days when she had to face the image of her past, through videos, reenactments, or analyses of unconscious bias that she had once dismissed as a distant theory. She heard stories of passengers turned away, not because of their tickets, but because of the color of their skin. She saw charts showing how career opportunities, housing, and education were stripped away due to a system of racism operating like a silent machine. And most importantly, she listened, and was required to listen, to people who were once like Evelyn, but who didn't have the power to be publicly apologized to. She didn't resist. She listened, took notes, learned again from scratch, like a child. 6 months later, Julia returned to the airline's headquarters, this time not to receive a promotion or praise, but to submit her progress report to Evelyn and the board of directors. In the meeting, she was no longer the woman who had shouted at an elderly black woman in the airport. She was someone who knew when to be silent, when to stop and observe, when to ask questions instead of make assumptions, and most importantly, someone who humbly recognized her past mistakes. Evelyn read the report, flipping through each page with a deep, unreadable gaze. Finally, she looked up, meeting Julia's eyes. "Do you think you've changed?" Julia took a deep breath. The question wasn't just a test. It was a final opportunity to speak honestly or to continue hiding. "I don't think I've changed enough," she said. "I just think I've started to see things I chose not to see before, and I won't stop here." Evelyn nodded slowly, a small smile appearing at the corner of her mouth. "That's enough for today, but not enough for a lifetime. Keep going." That afternoon, in the thin sunlight casting over the airport, Julia stood before a group of young new flight attendants in their first training session. She stood there, in her new role, a guide on service culture and anti-bias. "Remember," she said with a steady but calm voice, "every passenger boarding the plane doesn't just carry luggage. They carry their stories, their invisible wounds. Never be the person who makes them feel they don't belong here." As the young eyes looked at her with respect, Julia Monroe knew she was no longer the same person. The story ended not with revenge, but with an opportunity, and the rebirth of a soul once lost. In a world still filled with so much injustice, perhaps the strongest thing is not the power to punish, but the kindness to offer a chance for change. Evelyn Crawford did that, and Julia, the one who was once the antagonist, had begun another journey. The journey of becoming a kinder person, day by day, choice by choice, word by word. And sometimes that is the only thing needed to make the world a little bit better. What about you? If you were Evelyn in this story, would you have the grace to offer someone who once offended you the chance to change? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touched you, please like, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Thank you for watching.